I still hear the sound of that morning in my head, even when everything around me is silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the kind that arrives after something has already gone wrong, when the world is still moving, but your heart has stopped understanding how to move with it. It was supposed to be a happy day. That is the part I keep returning to again and again, like if I understand it enough times, maybe it will change. Maybe the outcome will shift. Maybe I will find the moment where I could have stopped everything from breaking. We were getting ready for a party that evening. A small gathering, nothing too formal, just laughter, food, music, and people we hadn't seen in a long time. My husband was excited in his own quiet way, talking about old friends coming together again. I was moving around the house, trying to balance everything: the cooking, the cleaning, and most importantly, the baby. My baby was only a few months old then. So small, so dependent on me for everything, like I was the entire world she knew. I remember how she would curl her fingers around mine whenever I held her, like she was afraid I might disappear if she didn't hold on tightly enough. That morning, she had been unusually calm, sleeping more than usual, barely crying. I remember thinking how lucky I was that she wasn't fussy that day, how it was almost like she was cooperating with the chaos of preparation around her. I was wrong. That thought still burns me. My husband kept reminding me of the time. "We need to leave early," he said, checking his watch again and again. "We don't want to be late." There was excitement in his voice. Not urgency, just anticipation. I nodded each time, saying yes, yes, I know, I'm almost done. But nothing about me felt ready. Between feeding the baby, changing her, and making sure everything at home was in order before we left, I felt stretched in a way I didn't have words for at the time. I wish I had stopped. I wish I had slowed everything down. But life doesn't always give you the warning signs in a language you understand. The baby was sleeping in her small crib when the final rush began. My husband was already dressed, calling for me from the other room. The guests were waiting. The clock was ticking louder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way because my mind was already splitting in too many directions. I stood there for a moment, looking at her. Her tiny chest rising and falling so softly that it almost felt like the world itself was breathing through her. I remember touching her cheek. Warm, peaceful, safe. I told myself I would only be gone for a short while, just a few hours. I would feed her before we left, and she would sleep through most of it anyway. She always did when she was this calm. That is how I justified it. That is how every mother justifies things when life asks too much at once. I wrapped her carefully, made sure she was comfortable, and placed her back down. I checked everything twice, then again, and again, the way new mothers do when their love is so large it turns into anxiety. My husband called again, slightly louder this time. I left the room. I didn't hear anything unusual when we left the house. No crying, no movement, just silence behind a closed door. And that silence followed me. At the party, everything looked normal at first. People were smiling, greeting each other, filling glasses, talking over one another. Music played softly in the background. I remember sitting there, trying to join conversations, trying to be present, but something inside me kept pulling back. It was like a thread tied to my chest, tightening slowly with every passing minute. I kept checking the time, not loudly, not obviously, just small glances at my phone, at the clock on the wall, at anything that would reassure me that everything was fine. But reassurance has a way of not coming when you need it most. Half an hour passed, then an hour. I tried calling home once, no answer. I told myself she was sleeping, that everything was fine, that I was being paranoid. Still, I excused myself more than once to check. And every time I stepped away from the noise of the party, I felt something heavier waiting for me in the quiet. I didn't know then that silence can be a warning. I didn't know that absence can sometimes mean more than presence ever did. And I didn't know that by the time I would finally understand, it would already be too late to change anything. I still remember the way I walked back into the room after that first phone call attempt, trying to look normal. Smiling when someone spoke to me, nodding when they laughed, pretending like I wasn't slowly losing my focus on everything happening around me. It is strange how easily people can act like nothing is wrong when something inside them is already breaking. I told myself again and again that I was overthinking, that my baby was safe, that I had checked everything before leaving, that mothers worry too much and imagine problems where there are none. I repeated it like a prayer, as if repetition could turn fear into truth. But fear doesn't listen to logic. It only grows in silence. The music at the party felt louder now, not because it changed, but because my attention to it was fading. Every sound around me started to feel distant, like I was underwater watching life happen from a place I couldn't fully reach anymore. I excused myself again. This time, I went outside the house completely. I stood in the small, open space near the gate and called again. Still no answer. That was the first moment my chest tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. I remember pressing the phone harder against my ear, as if that would somehow force a response from the other side. But there was only ringing, then silence, then nothing. I tried my husband's number next. He picked up quickly. "Why are you calling again?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and impatience. "Everything is fine, we just left her sleeping, didn't we?" I remember pausing before answering him, because something about the way he said it made me question myself for the first time. "Yes," I said slowly, "but can you just go back and check?" There was a small silence on his end, a hesitation, the kind people don't notice at first, but later realize was important. "She's sleeping," he said again. "We'll go back soon, don't worry so much." But I was already worrying. I just didn't yet understand what kind of worry it was going to become. When I returned to the party, I couldn't sit still anymore. My body was present, but my mind was no longer participating. Every laugh around me felt inappropriate. Every normal conversation felt wrong. I started watching the clock more openly now, unable to hide it. Someone asked me if I was okay. I smiled and said yes. It was the easiest lie I had ever told. Minutes passed like they were dragging something behind them. Heavy, slow, suffocating minutes that didn't feel like time anymore, but like something being taken away from me in small pieces. I tried calling again. This time, I think I already knew something had changed even before the call didn't connect properly. There was a strange feeling in my hands, a kind of numbness that started at my fingertips and spread upward. I don't know how to explain it except that my body was beginning to understand something my mind refused to accept. When my husband finally called back, his voice was different. Not loud, not panicked, just uncertain. "We're home," he said. I don't remember grabbing my things. I don't remember saying goodbye. I only remember running. The road between the party and home felt longer than it had ever been before. Every turn felt delayed, like the world itself was resisting my urgency. My thoughts were chaotic, but one image kept returning. My baby sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware of everything, waiting for me to come back like I promised. I kept telling myself she was fine. I had to be fine. But somewhere deep inside, something had already started preparing for a truth I was not ready to meet. When I reached the house, the door was slightly open. That detail still follows me. Not wide open, not closed, just slightly open, like someone had rushed in or out without thinking about it. I remember stepping inside slowly, as if the air itself had changed. The house felt different, not loud, not quiet, just wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. My husband was standing near the bedroom door. His face was pale, but not yet broken. There was confusion in his eyes, like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. "She's still sleeping," he said softly, "but I think something is off." Those words, "I think something is off." They didn't feel real when I first heard them. My mind refused to process them fully. I pushed past him without thinking, moving toward the room where she was. And that was the moment everything began to collapse. Because silence, when it is no longer peaceful, becomes something else entirely. And I was about to understand what kind of silence had been waiting for me all along. I don't think my feet were fully steady when I reached the doorway. It felt like I was moving through something thick, something that resisted me with every step, as if the house itself knew what I was about to see and didn't want me to enter. My hand touched the doorframe without me realizing it. I remember that detail clearly because I was trying to ground myself, to remind my body that I was still here, still real, still in control of something. But I wasn't in control anymore. The room was dim. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a thin line of light that cut across the floor like a warning. Everything looked almost exactly how I had left it, and yet nothing felt the same. And then I saw the crib. At first, my mind refused to focus properly. It's strange how the brain protects you for a few seconds by making reality blurry, like it's giving you time to prepare for impact. I took one step closer, then another. My husband was behind me, I think, but I couldn't hear him anymore. Or maybe I didn't want to. The crib was still there, exactly where it had been. The blanket slightly shifted, a small toy lying near the edge. Everything looked normal enough that my mind tried, for a brief second, to relax again. But my baby wasn't moving. That was the first real fracture in my thoughts. I leaned over slowly, my hands shaking before I even touched her. I called her name softly. Once, then again louder. No response. I picked her up. Her body felt too still in my arms. I remember that feeling more than anything else. Not the sight, not the sound, the stillness. That unnatural stillness that doesn't belong in something so small, so alive, so dependent on breath and warmth and movement. For a few seconds, I kept telling myself she was just deeply asleep. Bobbies sleep deeply sometimes, I thought. Maybe she was just not waking up easily. I tried to smile at my own thoughts, like I could trick reality into being softer than it was. But then I touched her hand. Cold. Not the cold of air conditioning or sleep or time passing normally. Something different. Something that made my stomach drop instantly before my mind even caught up. No, I whispered, even though I didn't know what I was denying yet. No, no, no. My voice sounded far away from me, like it belonged to someone else. Behind me, my husband made a sound. I don't remember if it was my name or something else. I only remember turning slightly, still holding her, still not fully understanding what was happening, even though my body already knew. The moment I looked at him, I saw it. The realization forming in his face, before it fully formed in mine. And that is when everything stopped pretending. The air in the room changed. Not physically, but emotionally, like the space itself had accepted a truth that I was still fighting against. I checked her again. My hands moved faster now, desperate, shaking uncontrollably. I called her name louder, closer to her ear, as if volume could reverse time. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. No response. Just silence. That silence was no longer peaceful. It was absolute. And suddenly, I understood what had been wrong all along, not just in that moment, but from the time I left the house. I had left her alone. Not for long, I told myself. Not intentionally, not carelessly. But none of that mattered anymore. My legs gave out before I even fully processed it. I remember collapsing to the floor, still holding her, as if letting go would make it real in a way I couldn't survive. My husband was beside me now, but even his presence felt distant. He was speaking, I think, or maybe crying. I don't know. Everything around me had turned into fragments of sound and movement that didn't connect properly anymore. All I could feel was the weight of her in my arms. And the unbearable realization that silence had a meaning I had never understood until it was already too late. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time stopped being something I could measure. There was only the room, the crib, and the baby who would never open her eyes again. And in that moment, I understood something I wish I had never learned. Some regrets don't arrive after mistakes. They arrive inside them. I don't remember standing up, but at some point I was no longer on the floor. My body had moved, not because I told it to, but because grief has its own way of forcing motion when the mind refuses to function. Everything felt disconnected. My hands, my breath, even my heartbeat, like they all belonged to different people. The room was still the same, but I was not. My baby was in my arms, and I kept holding her as if the pressure of my embrace could somehow pull her back into warmth, back into the small signs of life I was now desperately searching for in memories rather than reality. My husband kept saying my name. I could hear it, but it didn't register properly. It was like hearing something underwater, distant and distorted. "Call someone," he said at one point. But I couldn't move. I couldn't understand why anyone would need to be called when everything I loved was right here, silent and broken in a way I didn't have words for yet. The world outside the room had not stopped. That was the strangest part. Somewhere beyond that door, life was continuing as if nothing had changed. People still existed. Time still moved. The party still probably went on in some forgotten corner of the evening. But inside me, everything had ended. I remember finally being guided, more than walking, to another part of the house. I don't know who moved first, me or my husband. I only remember sitting down somewhere, still holding her, refusing to place her anywhere else, as if distance would make it permanent in a way I couldn't undo. There were voices now, more people, questions, confusion, words like "check again," "maybe she's just," and then silence in between them as reality slowly settled into the room like dust. I clung to the word maybe. Maybe she's just sleeping too deeply. Maybe something can still be done. Maybe I was wrong. But even as I thought it, I knew. There are moments when hope doesn't feel like comfort, it feels like delay. Like something pretending to save you while truth waits patiently underneath it. At some point, someone touched my shoulder. I flinched, not because I was afraid of them, but because I didn't want anything else to exist in that space except what I was holding. They tried to take her from me. I resisted without thinking. My arms tightened instantly, instinctively, like a reflex built from every moment of motherhood I had ever known. Even now, even in this, I could not let go. "She needs to be checked," someone said gently. Checked? The word felt wrong in my ears. My baby wasn't something to be checked. She was something to be held, something to be protected, something I had failed without understanding I was failing. I don't know how long I stayed like that before I finally allowed them to take her. I think my strength simply ran out, not because I agreed, but because my body could no longer continue resisting reality. When she left my arms, the emptiness was immediate. Not emotional first, physical. Like something essential had been removed from me, not just from my hands, but from my entire existence. I remember staring at my empty arms afterward, unable to understand why they still existed if they were no longer holding her. Everything after that became fragmented. I heard words like "no response," "too late," and "we are sorry," but none of them felt like they were directed at me. They sounded like part of another conversation happening in another life. I was still trying to find her. Not in the room. Not in the explanations. But in the idea that this was not real. At some point, I stood near a wall, staring at nothing in particular. My husband was somewhere nearby, speaking to someone, answering questions, but I could not follow anything anymore. All I could think was one thing, repeating endlessly. I left her. Not for long. Not intentionally. Not knowing. But I still left her. And that truth didn't need explanation. It didn't need context. It didn't need forgiveness. It just stayed. Like silence that had finally found its voice. And now, I understood what the silence had been all along. It wasn't absence. It was consequence. After that night, I stopped understanding time in the way other people did. Days came, but they didn't feel like days. Nights arrived, but they didn't feel like rest. Everything became a continuous stretch of awareness that had no beginning and no end, just a heavy, constant presence that I had to survive inside of. People came to the house. I remember that, even though I don't remember their faces clearly anymore. They spoke softly, lowered their voices, avoided long eye contact. Some brought food that no one ate. Some just sat in silence, as if their presence alone was supposed to mean something comforting. But nothing reached me. I was still stuck in that room, still holding her, even when I was. My arms would sometimes move on their own, as if remembering weight that was no longer there. I would wake up, if sleep can even be called that anymore, reaching for her instinctively, only to find emptiness waiting for me again and again. That emptiness never became familiar. It stayed sharp. My husband tried to speak to me often in those early days. He would sit beside me carefully, as if I might break further with any sudden movement. He would say things like, "We need to eat," or "You should rest," or sometimes nothing at all. But there were no words that could enter me anymore. Everything inside me had narrowed to a single point of understanding. I had left my baby alone, and she had not returned from that moment. I replayed everything constantly. Not in dreams, not as memory, but as punishment. The moment I placed her in the crib. The moment I walked out of the room. The moment I heard silence and chose not to question it enough. The moment I told myself, just a little while. Each detail returned sharper than the last, as if my mind was determined to ensure I never forget the exact shape of my mistake. People began to stop talking about it around me after a while, or maybe they still talked, just not in my presence. There is a kind of silence people use when they believe speaking will make pain worse instead of better. But silence does not protect the broken mind. It only leaves more space for thoughts to echo. I stopped going outside for a while. The world felt too normal. That was the part I couldn't accept. How could the sun rise the same way it always had? How could neighbors still argue over small things? How could life continue in such a careless rhythm when mine had stopped so violently? One afternoon, I remember standing near a window, watching children play outside. Their laughter reached me faintly, carried by wind that didn't care what it was delivering. I felt something inside me collapse again, but this time more quietly. Not a sudden break. A slow sinking. Because I realized something I had been avoiding since that night. The world does not pause for grief. It only leaves you behind. There were moments when I wanted to scream, not out loud, but into everything. Into the sky, into the walls, into the idea that this could happen at all. But my voice never came. It stayed trapped somewhere deep, where even sound felt unnecessary. At some point, I began to avoid looking at her things. The small clothes folded in a corner. The tiny blanket that still held a faint memory of warmth. The objects that once meant a future now frozen in place. Each item felt like a question I couldn't answer. Why didn't I stay? Why did I think time would wait for me? Why did I believe later was safe? There were no answers. Only repetition. Only the same moment, over and over again, refusing to change no matter how many times I begged it to. And slowly, something else began to form inside me. Not acceptance, not healing, not peace, but understanding. A painful, unbearable understanding that I could not escape. Love alone is not enough to undo a moment. And regret, once born, does not leave. It only learns to live with you. There is a strange kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people who are still living normally, while you are no longer part of that normal. That is how it felt in the weeks after. People stopped visiting as often. Not suddenly, but gradually, like distance increasing without anyone noticing when it began. At first, there were daily calls, then occasional visits, then messages that came slower, shorter, more careful. I didn't blame them. I think I understood even then that grief makes others uncomfortable. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know where to place it. So they step back slowly, hopping not to hurt you further, while unknowingly leaving you more alone with it. But I was already alone. Even in a full room, I was alone. My husband tried to keep routine alive. He would wake up, go to work, come back, speak a few sentences, sit near me in silence, then leave again. It wasn't neglect. It was survival. Everyone was trying to survive in different ways, but none of us were surviving together. I stopped reacting to time. Morning, afternoon, night, they blended into each other without meaning. I would sit in one place for hours without realizing I hadn't moved. Sometimes I would hold something small in my hands without knowing why I picked it up. My thoughts kept returning to that day, not as memory anymore, but as something I was still trapped inside. What if I had checked once more? What if I had stayed just 5 more minutes? What if I had not trusted the silence? The questions didn't bring answers. They only deepened the weight. At night, sleep became something I avoided and something I couldn't control at the same time. When I did sleep, it wasn't rest. It was repetition. The same room, the same crib, the same silence waiting for me like it had been placed there on purpose. I would wake up with my heart racing, reaching out instinctively, and then remember again. Every single time. My body kept forgetting what my mind could never allow itself to forget. One evening, I found myself standing near her things again. I didn't plan to. I just ended up there like my feet had learned the route without my permission. The small clothes were still folded. The tiny socks were still in pairs. Everything looked unchanged, untouched by time, even though everything else had collapsed. I picked up one of the pieces slowly. It felt so small in my hands that it made me breathe differently. This is what she was. This is what I left. Not a concept, not a mistake, not a memory. A real, living part of me that depended entirely on my presence. My hands started shaking again, but this time I didn't stop them. I let it happen, because stopping it didn't change anything anymore. My husband saw me there. He didn't speak at first, just stood at a distance, watching quietly like he was trying to decide whether coming closer would help or harm. Eventually, he said softly, "You should not keep doing this to yourself." I didn't answer, because I didn't know what this was anymore. Was it remembering? Was it breathing? Was it existing in a world where she no longer did? He stepped closer slowly. "It wasn't your fault alone," he said. That sentence, it should have helped. It should have softened something. But instead, it created a conflict inside me that I couldn't resolve. Because I knew what he meant. And I also knew what I couldn't allow myself to accept. Fault does not divide easily when it is carried inside a mother's mind. It becomes whole, unbreakable, mine. That night after he left the room, I sat alone for a long time, not crying, not moving, just sitting with the weight of everything that could never be undone. And for the first time, a different thought entered me. Not a question, not a memory, but a fear. What if I never stop seeing that moment? What if this is not something time heals, but something time simply teaches you to live inside? And in that quiet realization, I understood something I had been resisting since the beginning. Some silences don't fade. They settle. And they stay. After some time, people stopped mentioning her name in front of me. It wasn't cruelty. It was caution. They thought they were protecting me from pain, as if avoiding the subject could soften what had already happened. But what they didn't understand was that her absence was not something that needed protection from mention. It was already everywhere. In every room I entered. In every silence that followed a conversation. In every moment, I tried to pretend I was still part of normal life. Not speaking her name didn't erase her. It only made it heavier inside me, like something so important that even language could no longer touch it. I began to notice that I avoided mirrors. Not because I didn't recognize myself, but because I did. There was a version of me before that day, and a version after. The face was the same, but the expression wasn't. Something in my eyes had changed permanently, as if they had seen something they were not designed to carry. My husband once gently suggested I try going outside more. "Fresh air might help," he said. I nodded, because that is what people expect from agreement, but I didn't go. Because outside, life still looked like life. And I couldn't reconcile that. I remember sitting by the window again one afternoon, watching a woman walking with her baby wrapped against her chest. The baby was moving slightly, tiny hands shifting, unaware of anything beyond warmth and safety. Something inside me broke quietly at that sight. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet fracture that spread slowly through everything I was holding together. I turned away from the window that day and didn't look outside for a long time after that. Inside the house, everything remained frozen in its own way. Not physically frozen, but emotionally paused. Conversations were brief. Meals were quiet. Even time spent together felt like everyone was waiting for something to return that would never return again. One evening, my husband tried to sit beside me for longer than usual. He didn't speak immediately. He just stayed there, present. After a while, he said, "We need to find a way to live again." The word again hit me strangely, because I wasn't sure I had ever left the moment I was trying to return from. I looked at him for a long time before speaking. "How do you live inside something you can't change?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, because there is no answer that fits that question properly. Not one that can be spoken easily. Not one that can repair what has already fractured. Days passed like that, slowly, quietly, without direction. I started noticing small things again, not because I wanted to, but because the mind eventually begins to notice even when the heart refuses to participate. The sound of the clock at night. The way sunlight moved across the floor at the same time each day. The distant noise of life continuing outside without permission. Everything was still happening, and I was still here. That realization didn't comfort me. It unsettled me, because I began to understand that survival does not always feel like survival. Sometimes it feels like being left behind inside your own life, forced to continue without something essential that cannot be replaced. One night, I found myself holding her small blanket again. I don't remember going to get it. I just remember it being in my hands. I sat with it for a long time, feeling its softness, trying to recall the shape of her presence through it, as if fabric could somehow hold memory strongly enough to bring her back for even a second. It didn't, but it reminded me. And reminders are not always kind. My tears came quietly that night, not in waves, not dramatically, just slowly, as if my body had finally accepted that it would carry this forever and had stopped resisting the weight of it. I whispered her name once, and then again, not expecting anything, just saying it because it still existed somewhere inside me that refused to go silent completely. And in that moment, I realized something I had been avoiding for a long time. I was not healing. I was learning how to continue breathing while broken. And there is a difference no one prepares you for. A difference that changes everything about how life feels afterward. Time had started to lose its sharp edges. Not because I was healing, but because pain, when it stays too long, stops arriving as shock and becomes something more like atmosphere. Something you breathe without noticing. Something that fills every space quietly until you forget what it felt like to not have it. People around me slowly began returning to their routines. I could see it in the way they spoke, in the way they planned things, in the way life naturally pulled them forward again. I watched them and felt something I didn't know how to name at first. It wasn't jealousy. It was distance. Like I was standing behind a glass wall, seeing life continue in a place I could no longer enter. My husband tried in his own way to rebuild normalcy between us. Small conversations, small efforts, small attempts at returning to what once was. But grief doesn't allow what once was to exist in the present. It replaces it with something quieter and heavier. We were not the same people anymore. We just occupied the same space. There were days when I would cook without thinking, then forget whether anyone ate. Days when I would clean the same surface twice without remembering I had already done it. My mind moved like it was trying to function while carrying something too heavy to coordinate properly. And still, the thoughts never left. That day, that moment, that silence, it always came back to silence. I began to understand something slowly, Something that didn't come as a sudden realization, but as a gradual acceptance that I didn't have control over anymore. Silence is not empty. It is full of everything you cannot undo. One afternoon, I sat outside briefly. It was unplanned. My feet just took me there without discussion with my mind. The air felt different outside. Not better, not worse, just different. Like the world had continued to evolve without waiting for me to catch up. A child nearby was laughing loudly while running in circles. The sound was sharp in my chest, not because it hurt, but because it reminded me that innocence still existed somewhere outside my memory. I closed my eyes for a moment, and I saw her again. Not clearly, not physically, but as a presence that my mind could still reconstruct even when my hands could not reach her. That was the strange part of loss. The body understands absence faster than the mind does. But the mind never fully agrees. That evening, I found myself speaking to my husband more than I had in a long time. Not about the past directly. We had stopped doing that. It was too sharp, too unstable. Instead, I asked him something quietly. Do you think I will ever stop seeing it? He understood what I meant without me needing to explain. He took a long time before answering. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think you might learn to carry it differently. Carry it differently. That phrase stayed with me long after he left the room. Because I realized I had been trying to escape something that could not be escaped. Something that had already become part of me in a way that could not be removed without removing everything else as well. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. So I sat near the window again. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer feels peaceful, just uninterrupted. I thought about how easily that morning had unfolded, how ordinary everything had been, how nothing had warned me in a way I could understand. That is what still haunts me most. Not that it happened, but that it happened inside, something so normal. I pressed my hand against my chest, not because I expected anything there, but because sometimes the body needs to confirm that it is still carrying something even when the mind is too exhausted to acknowledge it. And I understood something clearer than before. I did not lose her in a single moment. I lost her in the space between moments I thought I could afford. And that space is what I live in now. There are some kinds of pain that do not announce themselves anymore. They simply remain. Quietly. Consistently. Like they have always belonged there. By this point in my life, the sharpness had changed shape. It was no longer the sudden collapse I felt in those first days. It had become something slower, something that sat with me in every routine, every silence, every breath I took without her. I learned how to function again in small ways. Not because I recovered, but because life does not stop asking you to function, even when you are still broken. I would wake up, make tea, wash dishes, answer questions, respond when spoken to. From the outside, it may have looked like I was returning to normal, but inside, I was always carrying the same weight, just learning how to move with it without falling immediately. That is what people call adjustment. But it never felt like adjustment to me. It felt like endurance. My husband and I stopped trying to talk about it directly most of the time. Not because it was forgotten, but because every time we tried, it created a silence so heavy that even words felt unsafe inside it. So we spoke around it. About work, about household things, about daily needs. Anything except the thing that still defined every moment of both our lives. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't noticing. Not with blame, not with anger, just something quieter. Understanding, maybe. Or helplessness. I don't know which is heavier. One evening, while cleaning a small corner of the house, I found something I hadn't seen in a long time. A tiny object that belonged to her. It wasn't significant in size, but in that moment it felt like the entire world had condensed into it. My hands stopped immediately. I didn't move for a long time. It is strange how objects can suddenly open doors inside you that you thought had closed. I sat down on the floor without realizing it, holding it carefully. My breath changed again, becoming uneven, like it was remembering a version of me that no longer existed. And then I cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, like it had always been waiting for permission to return. Because grief does not disappear. It just waits for moments when you are less defended. My husband found me there later. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat nearby, as if proximity was the only thing he could offer without breaking me further. After a while, I spoke without looking at him. Do you think she knew I was coming back? My voice sounded distant, even to me. He hesitated. She was very small, he said gently. She only knew you were there. That answer should have comforted me. But instead, it deepened something inside me. Because I understood what he was really saying. She didn't understand absence the way I understand it now. That understanding belongs only to the one who remains. That night, I couldn't let go of the feeling that everything I had built my decisions on that day, time, urgency, assumption, had been wrong in ways I didn't recognize until it was irreversible. I kept replaying it again. Not because I wanted to, but because my mind had turned it into a loop it could not exit. What if I had trusted silence differently? What if I had treated stillness as something to question, not something to assume? What if love had made me more careful instead of more confident? But these questions never lead anywhere real. They only circle back to the same place. A place where nothing changes. A place where I still leave the room. Eventually, I stopped asking why so often. Because I realized why does not exist in a form that can undo what has already happened. Instead, I started living with after. After that moment. After that silence. After her. And after is a place that does not move forward. It only expands around you. That night, I sat by myself for a long time, listening to the quiet of the house, and I realized something I had not fully accepted before. I was not waiting for healing anymore. I was only learning how to exist inside what could never be repaired. And somehow, I was still here. There comes a point where even memories stop feeling like memories and start feeling like places you are still living inside. That is where I was now. Not in the past, not in the present. Somewhere in between, where time exists but doesn't move in a way that helps you escape anything. People around me had long stopped treating me like someone in immediate crisis. Life has its own way of deciding when grief is old enough to no longer demand constant attention. But grief does not follow those rules. It does not expire. It does not soften just because others have moved their attention elsewhere. It stays the same. Only your relationship with it changes. I learned to hide it better. Not because it became smaller, but because I became quieter. I stopped reacting outwardly to the things that triggered me. I learned how to sit through conversations while something inside me was breaking without showing it on my face. I learned how to answer questions with the correct tone even when my thoughts were somewhere else entirely. That is what survival looks like when it is not visible. My husband and I began functioning like two parallel lines, close enough to share space, but no longer intersecting in the way we once did. There was still care between us, still concern, still a shared history that neither of us could erase. But there was also a distance that neither of us knew how to cross anymore. One evening, he asked me something softly. Do you ever think about trying to move forward properly? I knew what he meant, but the question landed strangely inside me. Because I had been moving forward every day. I just wasn't leaving anything behind. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I don't think I know what forward means anymore, I said. He didn't respond immediately. Because there is no simple way to define forward when part of your life has stopped permanently. Later that night, I found myself standing near the same window again. It had become a habit without intention, a place I returned to when my mind became too heavy to stay inside my body fully. Outside, everything looked normal again. That word, normal, had started to feel foreign to me. Children were still playing. People were still walking. Lights still turned on and off in houses that did not carry the same weight mine did. Life had not paused. It had simply continued elsewhere. And I was still inside the moment that ended mine. I pressed my forehead lightly against the glass. Not for comfort, just for presence. To feel something physical, while my mind drifted again to that day I could never fully leave. There are nights when I still hear silence differently. Not as absence, but as consequence. As something that arrives after choice, after assumption, after time is taken for granted. I used to believe mistakes were events. Something that happens once and then becomes memory. But I understand now that some mistakes become environments. You do not step out of them. You learn to live inside them. And that is what I have done. My thoughts drifted that night to something I had not fully allowed myself to consider before. Not forgiveness, not healing, but acceptance of permanence. That nothing I do now will ever change what happened. That no version of me in the future will undo that morning. That no amount of regret will reverse silence once it has already spoken its final form. And strangely, in that realization, there was a kind of stillness. Not peace, but clarity. A painful clarity that does not comfort you, but stops you from fighting reality in ways that exhaust you further. I sat down slowly on the floor near the window. No tears at first. Just breathing. Just awareness. Just the steady presence of everything I carry that will not leave me. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped asking myself what I should have done differently. Because I finally understood. Some truths are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be carried. And I have been carrying them ever since. There are days when I almost convince myself that I am fine. Not healed. Not restored. But functioning in a way that resembles life closely enough to fool the surface of things. I wake up. I move through tasks. I respond when spoken to. I follow routines that give shape to hours that would otherwise dissolve into nothing. From the outside, nothing seems unusual anymore. But inside, everything still carries her absence like a permanent weight. It has not lessened. It has simply become familiar. Familiarity is not healing. It is adaptation. And adaptation is what the mind does when it cannot escape. My husband and I have learned new silences now, not the painful kind that used to fill the house in the beginning, but softer ones. The kind that come after both people understand that some conversations will never lead anywhere new. We speak when necessary. We stay quiet when words feel too heavy. We exist in parallel rhythms that rarely collide anymore. One afternoon, while sitting alone, I found myself thinking about how strange memory is. How it chooses what to sharpen and what to soften. Some moments from that day are still crystal clear to me. The sound of the phone, the feel of rushing, the shape of silence in the room. But other details are fading, as if my mind is slowly trying to protect me by letting go of edges that cut too deeply. But even as some details blur, the meaning never does. That never changes. I still remember her weight in my arms. I still remember the silence that answered everything. I still remember the exact moment my life divided into before and after. And I still remember what I cannot forgive myself for. There are moments when I wonder what kind of mother I am now in the eyes of time. Not in judgment from others, but in the way life itself records things. Do mistakes like mine define a person permanently? Or do they simply become part of a larger story that never stops unfolding? I don't know. And maybe there is no answer that can satisfy that question. One evening, my husband sat beside me longer than usual again. He didn't bring up the past directly. He rarely does now. Instead, he just asked quietly, "Do you feel anything changing at all?" I understood what he was really asking. He wasn't asking about healing. He was asking about survival. I looked down at my hands for a long time before answering. I feel like I am learning how to live without something I was never meant to lose, I said slowly. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And that listening itself felt like a kind of acceptance between us. Not of what happened, but of what remains. Later that night, I couldn't sleep again. Sleep still comes irregularly, without permission, and leaves just as unpredictably. When it doesn't come, I don't fight it anymore. I just sit with it, like I sit with everything else now. I went to the window again. The same place. The same view. The same quiet world continuing outside, my unchanged inside. I thought about how life doesn't announce its irreversible moments when they are happening. There are no warnings loud enough to fully prepare a person for permanence. Everything feels ordinary until suddenly it is not. That is the part I keep returning to. Ordinary. How something so ordinary became the dividing line of everything I would ever be after. I closed my eyes for a moment. Not to escape, but to remember. And I realized something that has been forming quietly inside me for a long time. I am no longer living in the moment that broke me, but I am still living with its echo in every moment that follows. And maybe that is what after truly means. Not leaving it behind, but carrying it forward without it ever becoming lighter. I don't talk about moving on anymore. That phrase never felt honest to me, not even when people said it with kindness, because nothing about this life has moved on. It has only continued. And continuation is not the same as healing. Years have passed now, though I no longer measure them the way I used to. Time feels less like a line and more like a space I move through carefully, aware of what it contains. There are days when I function so normally that even I forget, for a brief moment, the depth of what lives beneath me. I can laugh at something small. I can respond to someone without delay. I can sit through an entire day without breaking visibly. But then there are other moments. A sudden silence in a room. A memory triggered without warning. A thought that arrives without invitation. And in those moments, everything returns, not as it was, but as it remains. My baby is still there, in the way my mind holds her. Not physically, not in time, but in a place that never closed, even when everything else did. I have learned that grief does not leave. It changes shape. It becomes part of the structure of your thoughts, part of how you understand quietness, part of how you interpret love and absence together. There are no more questions I ask myself about that day. Not because I have answers, but because I understand now that answers were never going to change what happened. What remains is acceptance of something unchangeable. And acceptance is not peace. It is awareness without escape. My husband and I still share a life, though it is quieter now in a way that cannot be explained easily. We have learned how to exist without forcing what cannot return. There is care between us still, and understanding that has grown in different ways, shaped by loss rather than absence of love. Sometimes we sit together, without speaking for long stretches of time. Not because there is nothing to say, but because everything important has already been lived through in ways that words cannot fully hold anymore. One evening, I found myself holding her memory again, not in an object, not in a photograph, but simply in thought. And instead of breaking the way I once did, I stayed still. That is what has changed. Not the pain, but my ability to stand inside it without collapsing every time it arrives. I have come to understand something I never wanted to understand. You do not get over moments that define the shape of your life. You learn how to carry them without letting them carry you completely. And some days, that is enough. Other days, it is not. But life does not ask which kind of day it is. It only continues. So I continue with it. With everything I am. With everything I lost. With everything I will always remember, but can never return to. And somewhere inside that continuation, I have learned to speak her name quietly in my heart, not as a wound that reopens, but as a presence that never truly left the part of me that still knows how to love her. Even now, even after everything, even in silence, and even now, after everything, there are moments when I still feel like I am standing between two lives. One where everything was still normal, and one where nothing ever returned to what it was. The space between those two lives is where I exist now. Not fully in the past, not fully in the present, just somewhere in between. Years have passed, but time has never really taken that day away from me. It has only placed distance around it, like a frame around something that cannot be erased. And no matter how far I walk, I never truly leave it behind. I have learned how to speak again, how to respond, how to exist in conversations without completely breaking apart. But there is always a part of me that is listening for something else, something that will never come. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that changed everything. There are days when I sit alone and try to remember her voice, even though she was too small to speak. I try to remember her movements, the way her fingers curled, the way she breathed, the way she needed me without ever having to say it. And every time I remember, something inside me tightens again. Because I was her world, and I stepped out of it. Not forever, not intentionally, just long enough for everything to end. I used to think mistakes were loud, obvious, something you could recognize in the moment and correct before it became permanent. But now I know the most dangerous mistakes are the quiet ones, the ones that feel small, the ones that feel temporary, the ones you believe you'll come back from. That day, nothing felt final. Nothing felt irreversible. It just felt like a rush, a moment, a delay. And then it became everything. Sometimes, I still imagine a different version of that day. One where I turn back. One where I check again. One where I don't rush. One where I choose differently. And in that version, she is still here. Breathing. Moving. Growing. Living a life that I was meant to be part of. But imagination is a cruel kind of comfort. It shows you what could have been, without ever giving it to you. And so I return again to what is real, to what remains, to what cannot be changed. My husband and I rarely speak about it now. Not because we have forgotten, but because we both carry it in ways that don't need words anymore. Sometimes I catch him looking at families, at children, at moments that should have been ours. And I know he is thinking the same thing I am. But we don't say it, because saying it does not bring anything back. It only reminds us of what is gone. There is a kind of understanding that grows in silence. Not healing, not forgiveness, just shared weight. We carry it together, even when we are quiet, even when we seem distant, even when we are not speaking. Because some things do not need language. They exist deeper than that. There are nights when I sit by the window and watch the world move the way it always has. Cars passing, lights turning on and off, people going somewhere, coming back from somewhere, living their lives in ways that feel so simple, so normal. And I wonder how many of them believe they have more time than they actually do. How many of them are trusting moments that cannot be trusted. How many of them are standing on the edge of something irreversible without knowing it. Because I didn't know. I didn't feel it. I didn't see it coming. That is what stays with me the most. Not just what happened, but how quietly it happened. How ordinary it felt. How nothing warned me in a way I could understand. And that is why, even now, I don't rush anymore. Not for anything. Not for anyone. Because I know what rushing can take from you. I know what a single moment can cost. I know what silence can become. If I could speak to the version of myself from that day, I wouldn't say much. I wouldn't explain everything. I would just tell her one thing. Slow down. That's it. Just slow down. Because everything you think can wait, cannot. Because the moment you are leaving matters more than you realize. Because love is not just feeling. It is attention. It is presence. It is staying when leaving feels easier. But I cannot speak to her, and she cannot hear me. So I carry that message in a different way now. Not as something I say, but as something I live. Carefully, quietly, with awareness that never fades. And sometimes, in the stillness of everything, I feel something that I cannot fully explain. Not peace, not relief, but a softer kind of pain. One that does not break me the way it used to. One that sits beside me instead of crushing me. One that reminds me she was here. She existed. She mattered. She was loved. And even though I failed in a moment, my love for her never left. It never will. That is the only thing I still hold on to. Not as forgiveness, not as redemption, but as truth. Because even in silence, even after everything, I am still her mother. And I will carry her for the rest of my life.